In the last class, we looked at the dialogue with the Dean of Studies, Stephen's dialogue with the Dean of Studies. And now there is a long section, conversation among Stephen's university friends. And since it is a novel which represents youth, so friendship is very important in youth, and that is why probably why Joyce assigns so much space over discussion among friends. But we will only look at the salient parts of the long conversation. One important thing here is that a student named McCann, he is a political activist. Like in many colleges, universities, you find that there are some students who are active in politics, and they make speeches and make people sign petitions and so on. So here it is in the context of possible war among European states, and the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, he had offered a peace proposal which is called the Peace Rescript in 1898, and McCann wants everybody to sign that peace proposal. So it is about universal peace or peace in Europe. So many students, they are either too afraid to oppose McCann, or they do not mind, so they sign the proposal, but Stephen does not. So we see that Stephen is entirely alone here, and therefore his friends look upon him as terrible because he has the courage to not to do something in which he does not find any interest. So McCann says, "Here you are," said McCann cheerily. "Here I am," said Stephen, and so on. And then McCann speaks on this issue. McCann began to speak with fluent energy of the Tsar's rescript of Stead. Stead is a man, William Thomas Stead, an English journalist who opposed war. Of general disarmament, arbitration in cases of international disputes, of the signs of the times, of the new humanity and the new gospel of life, which would make it the business of the community to secure as cheaply as possible the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number. So you can see that McCann is carried away by the emotion of politics, and he wants to do something good for humanity or for people and so on. So this is the point of view of all politicians, but actually they end up doing worse things than what they imagine. Whatever. So McCann tries to influence all other students in this matter, and several student characters are described here who have different reactions. Temple, then Cranley and others. Stephen is not interested. So he says, "The affair does not interest me in the least," said Stephen wearily. "You knew that well. Why do you make a scene about it? So you know that I am not interested in politics, I am interested in art. So you do not press me." "Good," said McCann, smacking his lips. "You are a reactionary then." "Do you think you impress me," Stephen asked, "when you flourish your wooden sword?" "Metaphor," said McCann bluntly. "Come to facts." So McCann does not accept Stephen's criticism, and he says, "Minor poets, I suppose, are above such trivial questions as the question of universal peace." So he calls Stephen a minor poet and thinks that Stephen is playing the intellectual or behaving like one, and he is not participating in the political issue. Cranley often speaks in Latin because he is like a senior student, Stephen knows better Latin than him, but Stephen never speaks in Latin. So it is the mediocre students who always try to, quote things which they half understand. So Stanley says, "Pax super totum sanguinarium globum," which means peace over the entire bloody globe. Stephen, moving away the bystanders, jerked his shoulder angrily in the direction of the Tsar's image, saying, "Keep your icon. If we must have a Jesus, let us have a legitimate Jesus." So McCann had brought the picture of the Tsar, and Stephen says that if you have to worship an icon, then worship a proper icon like Jesus. So you have a legitimate Jesus and not a political leader like the Tsar. "By hell, that's a good one," said the gypsy student to those about him. "That's a fine expression. I like that expression immensely." So Stephen gets some supporters from his friends. Stephen, in the act of being led away, caught sight of McCann's flushed, blunt-featured face. So Cranley, who is Stephen's friend, he takes him away, saying that we are going to play handball. Cranley always speaks in Latin here. Nos ad manum balum jocabimus, means we are going to play handball. And Stephen is taken away by Cranley. So McCann is very angry. And Stephen tells him, "My signature is of no account," he said politely. "You are right to go your way. Leave me to go mine." So he says that you leave me my space. You go your own way. If you like politics, you do that. Now, I do not know whether you face it or not. Students often face that political leaders among student leaders, they often try to persuade all students to participate in politics. But Stephen says that you leave me my space. You do not have to force me. You go your own way. So Stephen appears very courageous here in rejecting McCann's proposal. And another student who is also a very dedicated political activist says intellectual crankery is better out of this movement than in it. Intellectual crankery, that is, intellectual whims, better it be out of the movement. And the name of this boy is McAllister. And Temple says that, "Did you hear what McAllister says? I bet that Cranley did not see that. By hell, I saw that at once." What did he see? That McAllister is envious of Stephen. So Joyce here is, he successfully represents the kind of conversation which goes on among young students, university students, how they try to pursue one another over issues. Some students are interested in arts, others in politics, and there are mediocre students, there are inferior students, there are these students, they either support one of the good students or they become satellites of the good ones, and so on. Then 2 pages later, Stephen asks whether Devin signed the petition or not, and he calls Devin tame goose, if you remember. Stephen bent down towards Devin, who, intent on the game, had paid no heed to the talk of the others. "And how is my little tame goose?" he asked. "Did he sign too?" Devin nodded and said, "And you, Stevie?" Stephen shook his head. And then Devin says, "You are a terrible man, Stevie," taking the short pipe from his mouth. "Always alone." This indicates that Stephen is alone because he can follow, or he dares to follow, his own desire, whereas others often yield to other people's suggestion. Even if they do not like something, they are easily persuaded. But Stephen cannot be persuaded. He has a mind of his own, and that is why he is alone. And this loneliness is also the trait of an artist. Then there is a conversation between Devin and Stephen, And as you saw earlier, that Devin represents, Irish culture, and Stephen is critical of Irish history and culture. So he tells Devin, when Devin tells him, okay, a tide began to surge beneath the calm surface of Stephen's friendliness. So Stephen is getting excited or agitated, and he says, "This race and this country and this life produced me. I shall express myself as I am." So Stephen says that even if I am, odd, even if I behave in an odd fashion, I am a product of this country and this race. So I will behave accordingly. So I am not also an outsider. I am also an Irish boy, but I am the product of this culture. "Try to be one of us," repeated Devin. "In your heart you are an Irishman, but your pride is too powerful." "My ancestors threw off their language and took on another," Stephen said. "They allowed a handful of foreigners to subject them. Do you fancy I am going to pay in my own life and person debts they made? What for?" "For our freedom," said Devin. "No honorable and sincere man has given up to you his life and his youth and his affections from the days of Tone to those of Parnell, but you sold him to the enemy or failed him in need or reviled him and left him for another." So Devin raises the cause of Irish nationalism, Irish freedom from the British, and Stephen says that it is useless. My ancestors, they gave up willingly their freedom to a handful of foreigners, and they threw away their language and culture for that of the enemy or that of the foreigner. And why should I pay their debts? Why should I sacrifice my life, my pleasure for them, for their mistake? And then when Devin says that you do that for our freedom, then Stephen says that everybody who tried to lead the freedom movement, referring to the leaders Tone and Parnell, you have always betrayed him. Ireland has always betrayed him and left him for another. And you invite me to be one of you. I would see you damned first. So I cannot be one of you. You abandon your own leaders. They died for their ideals, Stephen said. Our day will come yet, believe me. So this is a Fenian slogan, our day will come yet. The Fenian movement, the Irish nationalist movement. So he says that they died, but they had their ideals, and we will also be rewarded for our actions. And the next speech by Stephen is important because it indicates his power to see through the way society tries to impose uniformity on everybody. The soul is born, he said vaguely, first in those moments I told you of. It has a slow and dark birth, more mysterious than the birth of the body. When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. So the various ways in which society demands commitment, dedication and engagement from a person, those impose restrictions on the person's free development. So Stephen uses the flight imagery and says that you want to restrict the flight of everybody. Whenever a soul is born, meaning whenever one comes into consciousness, one becomes a mature person, then you try to get complete dedication from that person by raising the issues of language, nationality, religion and so on. So these are the nets by which you catch a soul and stop it from flying. but I will fly by those nets. That is, I will not be caught in those nets. In other words, through Stephen, Joyce is criticizing the very restrictive and narrow culture of Ireland. So neither the nationalist movement nor the Roman Catholic religion nor the question of Irish language, none of these ideals or movements, they are liberal enough to allow a person free flight of imagination. Devin does not understand what Stephen is saying. Too deep for me, Stevie, he said. But a man's country comes first, Ireland first. Stevie, you can be a poet or a mystic after. So the irony of history is that mediocre people become much better committed soldiers to any cause, because this kind of commitment demands emotional attachment without much intellectual rationalization. So Devin can get emotionally attached to the cause of Irish nationalist movement, but Stephen does not, because he is rationalizing. He is trying to understand the ideal and the cause by rational analysis, not only of the cause itself but also of the history of the movement, and he finds that the history is very sordid. He finds that Roman Catholic religion has a very pernicious influence on people, and the issue of Irish language does not satisfy him, because there is a possibility of taking revenge in a nobler way by writing great works in English, the language of the enemy, and defeating them in their own language. So none of these causes, nationalism, religion or language, attract him, and they all appear to be restrictive. But it is not possible for Devin to do so much of intellectual thinking. Then Stephen and Lynch, they have a conversation, and Stephen begins his discussion on art. Aristotle, Stephen says, Aristotle has not defined pity and terror, I have. So Stephen has formulated definitions of pity and terror which Aristotle mentions in his Poetics with respect to the achievement of catharsis in tragedy. Stephen defines pity. Pity is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings and unites it with the human sufferer. Terror is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings and unites it with the secret cause. So, like a scholastic logician, Stephen provides definitions of pity and terror, and it is from this discussion that the discussion of aesthetic theory begins, beginning with the emotions of pity and fear, which a tragedy or a work of art is supposed to arouse in the mind of a spectator, according to Aristotle. So pity is when, Stephen defines both pity and terror as emotions which arrest the mind. That is, it brings the mind to a static position when the mind has a contemplative attitude. So in case of pity, the person considers the human sufferings depicted and unites it with the human sufferer, and therefore feels pity for him. And in case of fear or terror, the person considers the constant in human suffering and unites it with the cause. So contemplating the cause, he feels fear. So this is how the emotions pity and fear may be aroused in the mind of a person who is witnessing a tragedy or a work of art. The tragic emotion in fact is a face looking two ways, towards terror and towards pity, both of which are phases of it. So terror and pity, they are not opposed to each other, but they are phases of the same emotion, the tragic emotion. You see, I use the word arrest. I mean that the tragic emotion is static, or rather the dramatic emotion is. So the emotion in a tragedy, in drama, it becomes static in order to become a work of art. The work of art must produce a static emotion. Stephen would later explain this idea even better, why it is a static emotion. You say that art must not excite desire, said Lynch. I told you that one day I wrote my name in pencil on the backside of the Venus of Praxiteles in the museum. So it is a plaster cast of the Venus by the Greek sculptor Praxiteles, which is of course, you know, the statue of Venus in Greek art. It is a nude statue, and with parts of it locked off, that is, it is not complete, the arms are not complete, so it is partly broken, partly damaged statue, but it is a famous statue, the statue of Venus. And Lynch says that in the museum I jotted something, I wrote something on the plaster cast of the Venus statue. So in the museum the original statue is not there, but it is a copy or a replica, a plaster cast, on which he wrote his name. So writing the name on the statue signifies his desire, because so he says, was that not desire? I speak of normal nature, said Stephen. You also told me that when you were a boy in that charming Carmelite school, you ate pieces of dried cow dung. So Stephen says that you are abnormal because normal people will not be excited by looking at Venus, even though the statue is nude, because it is a work of art. Only people abnormal like you will be excited by looking at the statue of Venus. So Stephen's point is that true art does not excite desire. So desire means that it prompts you to do something more. It prompts you to action, that is how to fulfill your desire, how to get the object of your desire. Therefore, the influence or the impact of a work that excites somebody, like pornographic work, which would excite a person to desire, which would fan his libido, that would lead to a kinetic impact, kinetic as opposed to static. That is, the person would be prompted to act something more to fulfill his desire. So that is not, according to Stephen, art, because true art will not prompt one to action, but it will create a static emotion in the person. When the person is able to go above the the plane of desire and is able to contemplate on the work as a work of art. Lynch broke again into a whinny of laughter and again rubbed both his hands over his groins, but without taking them from his pockets. Then Stephen talks about rhythm, and this is very important. We will see later that rhythm is one of the three effects of art that Stephen borrows from Aquinas. So Stephen says rhythm is the first formal aesthetic relation of part to part in any aesthetic whole, or of an aesthetic whole to its part or parts, or of any part to the aesthetic whole of which it is a part. So rhythm is the relationship between the parts and the whole, which indicates that in a work of art, the different parts of the work of art, they are in a particular proportion and related to the whole in a particular manner, in a particular proportion or ratio. And this creates a rhythm, which we may say a rhythm of structure, that is the relationship between part and whole. Lynch goes on to ask Stephen what is the definition of beauty. Aquinas, said Stephen, says that beautiful is the apprehension of which pleases. So Lynch says, yes, I remember, pulchra sunt quae visa placent. So you see, Stephen translates visa by apprehension. So what one perceives with the senses. So not only sight, but Stephen thinks that the word visa in Aquinas stands for all the senses, whatever one perceives with the senses. So whatever perception pleases us, that is beauty, according to Aquinas. This word, though it is vague, that is the word visa, it is clear enough to keep away good and evil which excite desire and loathing. It means certainly a stasis and not a kinesis. So good and evil, consideration of good and evil would lead you either to desire good or to hate evil. And therefore, such considerations cannot be called artistic considerations. So the consideration of good and evil is moral consideration. And moral consideration prompts you to do something, either to desire good or to reject and hate evil. But art does not prompt you to do anything. Therefore, art produces a static emotion. And that is why in aesthetic theory or aestheticist theory, art for art's sake, aestheticist theory, art is not considered moral or immoral, but amoral, which means that it is indifferent to morality. Art is amoral, neither moral nor immoral, but indifferent to morality. And Stephen explains this. Stephen says that Plato said that beauty is the splendor of truth. It is a beautiful expression, but I do not think that it has any meaning. And why? Because when Plato says beauty is truth, the consideration of truth is the consideration of morality. And for Stephen, morality cannot be part of artistic consideration or aesthetic consideration. Therefore, he thinks that Plato's statement may be nice to hear, may be wonderful to hear, it has an attraction, but it does not have any meaning. It is meaningless because in art the consideration of morality cannot be there. So we have to remember that Stephen creates an aesthetic theory which is an aestheticist theory. Aristotle's entire system of philosophy rests upon his book of psychology, and that I think rests on his statement that the same attribute cannot at the same time and in the same connection belong to and not belong to the same subject. The first step in the direction of beauty is to understand the frame and scope of the imagination, to comprehend the act itself of aesthetic appreciation. Even though Stephen does not always correctly interpret Aristotle. Here he is saying that Aristotle spoke about the mind. So even though Aristotle speaks about the mind, he does not narrowly speaks about psychology, and therefore Stephen's interpretation is not completely correct. But here he says that to comprehend the act of aesthetic apprehension. So what is important is understanding what is. Then Lynch goes on repeating the question, what is beauty? And Stephen is forced to talk about beauty and say that beauty is also relative from uh, person to person, race to race. So every race has its own idea of beauty. The Greek, the Turk, the Chinese, the Copt, the Hottentot, all admire a different type of female beauty. So if we consider the beauty of the female body, then there is no universal criterion. So every race has a different idea of female beauty. McAllister Lynch says, "It amuses me vastly to hear you quoting him time after time like a jolly round friar." That is, Stephen keeps quoting Aquinas. And are you laughing in your sleep? McAllister answered Stephen, would call my aesthetic theory applied Aquinas. So far as this side of aesthetic philosophy extends, Aquinas will carry me all along the line. When we come to the phenomenon of artistic conception, artistic gestation and artistic reproduction, I require a new terminology and a new personal experience. So Stephen says that my theory is not completely following Aquinas. It does not follow Aquinas slavishly. So up to certain point, for the basic discussion of art and aesthetic theory, Aquinas is helpful. But when I want to talk about the birth of the concept of any artistic work and its gestation and reproduction, that is how art is produced, then Aquinas cannot help me any longer, and I must find other theories, other sources. Then 2 pages later, the conversation continues. It's a very long conversation. To finish what I was saying about beauty, said Stephen, the most satisfying relations of the sensible must therefore correspond to the necessary phases of artistic apprehension. Find these and you find the qualities of universal beauty. So the process of apprehending something as art, if you can analyze the different phases of this artistic apprehension, then you will also be able to analyze beauty. Then he again quotes Aquinas. Aquinas says, ad pulcritudinem tria requiruntur integritas consonantia claritas. So here he gives the 3 qualities of art, which he borrows from Aquinas. Now, he borrows these ideas from Aquinas, but we'll see later that his interpretation of the terms are different from those of Aquinas. So Aquinas says that beauty has 3 requirements, 3 criteria: integrity, consonantia, and clarity. Then he gives an example of a basket. He says that you look at the basket. In order to see that basket, your mind first of all separates the basket from the rest of the visible universe, which is not the basket. The first phase of apprehension is a bounding line drawn about the object to be apprehended. An aesthetic image is presented to us either in space or in time. So music is also art, therefore he also has to consider that which is not seen but which is heard. So the first important task in perceiving any object of art is to find the boundary line which separates the object from the rest of the world. And when you can see that boundary line, then you can see the work of art in its integrity or integritas. And for music, when you see the boundary line of the sound which is that music and the sounds which are not part of that music, then you can perceive the music as integral. But temporal or spatial, the aesthetic image is first luminously apprehended as self-bounded and self-contained upon the immeasurable background of space or time, which is not it. You apprehend it as one thing. You see it as one whole. You apprehend its wholeness, that is integritas. So the first quality of a work of art is wholeness or integritas. Then he goes on to explain consonantia, which is harmony. Then you pass from point to point, led by its formal lines. You apprehend it as balanced part against part within its limits. So what Stephen said a little earlier about the relationship between the parts and the whole, that is actually a discussion of consonantia. That is the rhythm Stephen was talking about. This rhythm is the harmony or the consonantia, the relationship of the parts to the whole, in which proportion they are arranged. So first you have to identify the whole or the integrity of the art object. Then you can look at the parts and analyze or appreciate the relationship of the parts to the whole, which is harmony. In other words, the synthesis of immediate perception is followed by the analysis of apprehension. Having first felt that it is one thing, you feel now that it is a thing. So first oneness, then thingness. You apprehend it as complex, multiple, divisible, separable, made up of its parts, the result of its parts, and their sum harmonious. That is consonantia. Okay. So Stephen describes or explains consonantia as relations between parts and the whole. And the final quality will be claritas. But here Stephen is still explaining the thing. When you perceive a thing or the thingness, then you are looking into parts and whole, and he is using scholastic jargon, that is terms taken from scholastic philosophy, scholastic logic. Quiditas. Quiditas means thingness. When you have apprehended that basket as one thing and have then analyzed it according to its form and apprehended it as a thing, you make the only synthesis which is logically and aesthetically permissible. You see that it is that thing which it is and no other thing. The radiance of which he speaks is the scholastic quiditas, the whatness of a thing. The supreme quality is felt by the artist when the aesthetic image is first conceived in his imagination. So this whatness of the thing is also called a radiance or a luminosity, which is first perceived by the artist in his imagination. So Stephen is coming to the concept of claritas. The mind in that mysterious instant Shelley likened beautifully to a fading coal. In A Defense of Poetry, Shelley compares the power of the imagination as that of a fading coal. The instant wherein that supreme quality of beauty, the clear radiance of the aesthetic image, is apprehended luminously by the mind, which has been arrested by its wholeness and fascinated by its harmony, is the luminous silent stasis of aesthetic pleasure. A spiritual state very like to that cardiac condition which the Italian physiologist Luigi Galvani, using a phrase almost as beautiful as Shelley's, called the enchantment of the heart. So Galvani experimented with a frog by giving it electric shock, and the heart of the frog was temporarily suspended. So it did not die, but it was suspended. And Galvani was trying to prove the way electricity works, and he called it enchantment of the heart. Stephen uses this scientific example to explain the moment when the mind luminously understands or apprehends the beauty of a work of art. So that moment of stasis may be compared to enchantment of the heart, and Stephen calls it claritas. Now that I have explained Stephen's definition of integritas, consonantia and claritas, I will tell you that even though Stephen borrows these ideas from Aquinas, he differs from Aquinas. His interpretations are not the same as that of Aquinas, the medieval scholastic philosopher. For Aquinas, integrity is a metaphysical concept, not physical, meaning a certain combination of qualities innate in every nature. So this integritas is very different in Stephen's interpretation, because Stephen interprets integritas as integrity in a physical object or a physical work of art, whereas for Aquinas it was metaphysical. Stephen's integrity is non-metaphysical, wholeness of a work of art or an aesthetic wholeness. Alright. The second term, consonantia. When Aquinas speaks about consonantia, it is harmony between the parts of the whole. Aquinas speaks about the qualities of the thing. The harmony between the qualities of the object or of the work of art, not physical harmony. But Stephen thinks that consonantia means the rhythm of structure. As in abstract painting, there is a structure even in abstract painting where artists use colors, but the use of colors at different spaces in the composition of the canvas, they have a rhythm, parallelism and so on, particular relationship and a structure. So that kind of structural rhythm in a work of art, for Stephen that is consonantia. But for Aquinas again it is totally abstract. Aquinas talks about the relationship between the qualities of the thing. So we see here also Stephen differs. Then claritas. For Aquinas, claritas is a perception of the wonder of beauty. For Stephen, claritas is not a perception of God, but a perception first felt by the artist, inherent in the work of art, received by the recipient. Aquinas is always metaphysical in his discussion. So claritas for Aquinas, that is beauty, for him the perception of beauty is a perception of God, because he is a theologian after all. So all beauty for Aquinas is beauty of God. But when Stephen describes beauty or perception of beauty, then the question rises, perception of what? The claritas is a perception and a luminous perception, but perception of what? So aesthetic theory does not give us a clear answer to that. So this question is never raised in Stephen's aesthetic theory. What is perceived? So is the work of art different from the theological explanation of the world as a work of God? So that challenge, the theological challenge or the theological interpretation is never taken up by Stephen, and he never tells us what is the source of his theory, or what does he mean by claritas or perception of what. That question is not answered. Is it clear? So is it clear? In case of Aquinas defines everything in a metaphysical sense. He speaks about qualities, he speaks about God. But Stephen defines everything in an objective sense, but he does not finally mention what is the object which is being perceived, or perception of what. So for a theological philosopher like Aquinas, all beauty derives from God. But for Stephen, beauty derives from the physical proportion of things. But how this thing is perceived, what is this thing, that is not metaphysically defined by Stephen.